And so here we are in Leviticus chapter 17, and we've been journeying through Leviticus as this guidebook that takes us through what are the Levites to do as they lead worship, and as they not only just lead worship, but as they lead their community. Because this is before the days where there's the secular and the sacred divide. Everything in the community is sacred and or should be, especially the homes, which is why we went through all those chapters of regulations about homes and how to get rid of the mold or any contamination within a home or contamination within clothing, because God cares about how we pattern our daily life and our work. And so today we get into chapter 17, and it's talking about prohibitions against eating blood. Now, a lot of people over time have taken this to mean that, oh, you got to eat all of your meat well done, very well done, with no juice or blood in it. And that's not exactly what this is going to talk about. So let's dig into it. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Give the following instructions to Aaron and his sons and all the people of Israel. This is what the Lord has commanded. If any native Israelite sacrifices a bull or a lamb or a goat anywhere inside or outside of the camp, instead of bringing it to the entrance of the tabernacle to present it as an offering to the Lord, that person will be guilty as a murderer. Such a person has shed blood and will be cut off from the community." So this idea that the animals in their care are only to be sacrificed within the framework for offerings given to God. And if you decide, well, I'm in the mood for beef tonight, or I'm in the mood for goat, and you take it and you slaughter it yourself, you're committing murder. And that is a very harsh statement. But let's dig into why is this statement being made. Verse 5, the purpose of this rule is to stop the Israelites from sacrificing animals in the open fields. It will ensure they bring their sacrifices to the priest at the entrance of the tabernacle so he can present them to Lord as a peace offering. So remember, we're shaping a new society. We're setting up a way for God's people to be set apart. And God is saying there is nothing that you have in your flock or an increase in your field that doesn't belong to God. God has given you everything you have, every good gift, every animal, every crop. And the Israelites were supposed to be setting aside the first fruits, the 10th, as a portion to be brought to God. And so by making it against the law for them to sacrifice on their own and outside, God is elevating the centrality of the temple and the tabernacle, the idea that all of their society is going to function around this, and that everything is an act of worship. And so we've gotten very far away from that idea in our modern times, that, you know, we associate what we do on Sunday or what we do in Bible study or what we do in morning prayer as an act of worship. But we don't necessarily think of doing the dishes or sweeping the kitchen floor or going to the gym as an act of worship. But those activities in God's purview are the ways that we use our body and the ways that we take care of our homes and our environment is worshiping the Creator who made them. And so God continues that the priest will be able to splatter the blood against the Lord's altar at the entrance of the tabernacle, and he will burn the fat as a pleasing aroma to the Lord. The people must no longer be unfaithful to the Lord by offering sacrifices to the goat idols. This is a permanent law for them to be observed to generation. Now, this can also be translated as sacrifices to goat demons. But remember, this is talking about a very different time in history where all around the Levites and the Israelites are Canaanites and different tribes and different nations that all have gods that they sacrifice to. And the only meat that was really ever consumed was first sacrificed to an idol. And so God is elevating the worship in the temple and saying, you can't sacrifice to any other god. And to prevent you from doing that, all of your sacrifices must come here. Verse 8, give them this command as well. If any native Israelite or foreigner living among you offers a burnt offering or a sacrifice, but does not bring it to the entrance of the tabernacle to offer it to the Lord, that person will be cut off from the community. The idea that Israelites were responsible for the people living in their household. It doesn't matter if it was a native born or a foreigner living among them. Someone who's chosen to be part of this community, or someone who has been part of this community through their service and their position, all of them are expected to adhere to these community norms. This idea that, if they're going to be one people set apart, there can't be a different set of practices for a different group. Verse 10, and if any native or foreigner living among you eats or drinks blood in any form, I will turn against that person and cut him off for the community of your people. For the life of the body is in its blood. I have given you the blood on the altar to purify you, making you right with the Lord. It is the blood given in exchange for life that makes purification possible. That is why I have said to the people of Israel, you must never eat or drink blood, neither you nor the foreigners living among you. So again, there are different religious practices and different times that have involved drinking blood or slitting the throat of an animal and using that blood in a ritual or a sacrifice. And God is saying the life of an animal is in its blood, and that life belongs to me. Every life, whether they acknowledge God or not, gets its being from our God, is what this passage is telling us. And so all of those lives belong to God. And so to drink the blood or the life force of a creature is contrary to God's design and God's desire. Now, you and I can't really imagine sitting down and drinking a nice warm glass of blood. That's not something that we would consider. But we also live in a society that is blessed with abundance of food and resources and vitamins and minerals. And the practice of drinking blood is something that was done when people are iron deficient or other types of deficiencies. You could see how someone might crave this or do this. It's not something that appeals to us, but if it was a way that you thought that you could feel stronger and more powerful, and that by drinking this life force, you gained it in addition to your own, that was a superstition that was practiced and followed. And it's foreign to us, which is why a lot of people, when they read this passage now, instead of associating with this, okay, I'm not going to slit the neck of an animal and drink from it, we think, okay, when I eat a steak, I need to cook it well done. That's not what God is asking for here. It is asking that we don't sacrifice to other gods, and we don't consume the life force of an animal in a way that is superstitious or believing that will give us God's power. So that's where this all comes from, and the idea that we're to be purified through atonement, not strengthened through superstition. Verse 13, if any native Israelite or foreigner living among you goes hunting and kills an animal or bird that is approved for eating, he must drain its blood and cover it with earth. The life of every creature is in its blood. That's why I have said to the people of Israel, you must never eat or drink blood, for the life of any creature is in its blood. So whoever consumes blood will be cut off from the community. So the hunting is allowed. Eating meat is allowed. Consuming other creatures that are within the clean animals list is acceptable in the Israelite community. But you got to field dress it first, which means you elevate it, you make a cut, and you let the lifeblood drain out. And you honor that lifeblood by covering it over with the dirt, meaning that way the animals, the jackals, the various creatures that might come to prey upon that aren't able to, or at least not as easily. That is a way that you can honor that this life was given to sustain yours, even if you're not offering it as a sacrifice to God. Verse 15, and if any native-born Israelites or foreigners eat the meat of an animal that died naturally or was torn up by wild animals, they must wash their clothes and bathe themselves in water. They will remain ceremonially unclean until evening, but then they will be clean. But if they do not wash their clothes and bathe themselves, they will be punished for their sin. Remember last week we went through all of these various processes that were designed to help people keep them healthy. And so we don't eat roadkill very commonly, and we don't eat animals that die of disease now because we worry about contracting those diseases ourselves. God knew the dangers associated with these types of behaviors. And so the idea is you are unclean. It doesn't mean you're cut off forever, but there's a period of time where you remain apart from everyone else, and you have to wash your clothes to prevent any spread of disease. So that closes out a lot of these daily practices in terms of food, clothing, and shelter. And now God is going to talk about a lot of different sexual practices and the ways that we use our bodies to give glory or not to God. And so there's an introductory passage to this chapter. These first 5 chapters talk about why. Why are all of these rules? Why are all of these regulations? And what purposes do they serve? So the Lord said to Moses, give the following instructions to the people of Israel. I am the Lord your God. So do not act like the people in Egypt, where you used to live, or like the people of Canaan, where I am taking you. You must not imitate their way of life. You must obey all of my regulations and be careful to obey my decrees, for I am the Lord your God. If you obey my decrees and my regulations, you will find life through them. I am the Lord. So these are designed to be life-giving practices. They're designed to help us. They are designed to set the Israelites apart from communities around them that are not observing these practices. And why are these rules given? Well, a lot of these rules given are actually things that Israel learned the hard way. Some of these things are things that David did. Some of these things that are things that Israel did, or before he was Jacob. But all of these things are things that, they don't mean you're cut off and damned forever, but they're going to make your life harder or more difficult, or they're going to potentially mar the witness of your community. And so there's this long list. And then whenever you have a list of behaviors in the Bible, it's important to ask why. Well, the answer is because these were things that people were doing. Presumably, these are things that people in the Israelite community were doing, that they had absorbed as practice from either the Egyptians, or God knows they will do them based on their encounters with the Canaanites. And why now? Remember, God is setting up the entire Israelite community to be like a city on a hill, a beacon of God's love and presence. The idea is that through the covenant and the commandments being kept, this people is going to be so blessed, so set apart as this is the joy of living in close connection with God, that other people will want to be a part of that. So not all of these are life-altering deal breakers, God will never forgive you, but all of these are things that would harm the Israelites' ability to witness to God's good and God's glory. So let's get into them. Verse 6, you must never have sexual relations with a close relative, for I am the Lord. I would hope that is not a rule that we need to be told, but it evidently is, because throughout history, not just in the Israelite tradition, but continuing on up until not all that recently, people in power would continue to marry people from within their family line to keep that power centralized, or to keep that property and that land available just to them. And that is a temptation that can lead to various diseases and illnesses, and also just not great family dynamics. So God says, don't do that. Do not violate your father by having sexual relations with your mother. She is your mother. You must not have sexual relations with her. Do not have sexual relations with any of your father's wives, for this would violate your father. Do not have sexual relationships with your sister or your half-sister, whether she is your father's daughter, your mother's daughter, or whether she was born into your household or someone else's. So God starts with something general. Don't have sex with a close relative, and particularizes it with, this is what I mean by all of this. None of this is okay. Why? Well, God knows that our human hearts are prone to look for exceptions and to say, well, this is okay. Yeah, this is a stepsister or a step sibling or a blah, 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 blah. God knows human hearts are prone to fallen behavior. And so it's all spelled out here. Do not have sexual relations with your granddaughter, whether she is your son's daughter, your daughter's daughter, for this would violate yourself. Do not have sexual relationships with your stepsister, the daughter of any of your father's wives, for she is your sister. Do not have sexual relationships with your father's sister, for she is your father's close relative. Do not violate your uncle, your father's brother, by having sexual relations with his wife, for she is your aunt. Do not have sexual relations with your daughter-in-law, she is your son's wife, so you must not have sexual relations with her. Do not have sexual relationships with your brother's wife, for this would violate your brother. Do not have sexual relations with both a woman and her daughter, and do not take her granddaughter, whether her son's daughter or her daughter's daughter, and have sexual relations with her. They are close relatives, and this would be a wicked act. God's like, here's all the ways that you shouldn't be doing this. Now, does this mean if you can find a very specific, weird example of someone who somehow isn't one of these categories but might be considered your relative, that it's okay? No. But God says don't do all of these things. Yet, God knows that we will. At some point in the human history and in the genealogy of Jesus, these norms have been broken. God can redeem those, that never made them okay. While your wife is living, do not marry her sister and have sexual relations with her, for they would be rivals. Now, remember, David has this idea, also Jacob, with Leah and Rachel. It's time and time again, God's people have learned this one the hard way, that sister wives is never a good idea. I mean, I imagine many of us would argue it's tough for a man to keep one woman happy, let alone two, and much less two that are related and therefore have some rivalry built in. Just don't do it. Do not have sexual relationships with a woman during her period of menstrual impurity. We already talked about this. God already laid this out a few chapters ago, why this is unclean. But the penalty for it is just unclean for a day, not for a lifetime. And I think that's important in this list to talk about, that some of these are unclean for a day, and some of these set you up for a lifetime of hardship. Do not defile yourself by having sexual intercourse with your neighbor's wife. Again, we've already had the 10 Commandments. We've already had Moses saying, do not commit adultery. God says, don't do it. And yet we have these really long lists of, now, here's what I really mean by this. Don't do any of these things. Presumably because the Israelites are doing them. All right, so do not permit any of your children to be offered as a sacrifice to Molech, for you must not bring shame on the name of your God. I am the Lord. So Molech is a really disgusting god, little g, a god worshipped in some of the areas that they're going into. And Molech would be a statue that had a really big round mouth and arms outstretched. And you would place your child in the statue arms of Molech, and it would roll down the arms into the wide open mouth, down into a furnace of flame. And the idea behind this worship sacrifice was that God would use your fertility through your child to bless the fields and the crops and the fertility of the land. And God says, that's detestable. Do not do it. Do not practice homosexuality, having sex with another man as with a woman. It is a detestable sin. Now, this verse is one of the few verses out of this long list of Leviticus that Christians still quote and use in a way that says, don't do this, God hates you. The Westboro Baptist Church is famous for picketing with signs that say, God hates fags. And they use this verse as one of the justifications. Now, there's a group within the church called the Unclobber Movement. And the idea is they're trying to take verses like this and put them back in their original context so that people, when they hear them, are hearing the fullness of what was intended by this verse. And so I'm going to use one of my cheat sheets that I have on this verse to talk a little bit more about it. And if you want to know where I'm getting my information, it's from a book called Unclobber, Rethinking Our Misuse of the Bible on Homosexuality by Colby Martin. And there are lots of differing opinions on all of these, but I'm offering this perspective as a counterpoint. The idea is that this passage takes same-sex activity between two men as a tova, T-O-E-V-A-H in Hebrew, and translates that as a vile, gross abomination. Colby Martin makes the argument that tova was not about an offense that's inherently wrong, but was a violation of cultural boundaries, and that this prohibition is about a specific act and not any and all same-sex activity. He uses the idea also that this verse talks about nothing against lesbianism, and talks about how Leviticus was written for Jewish people as they entered the promised land, not for us 3,000 years later. So the idea of this verse was that Israel was called to live differently from those people around them. When they entered the promised land, they were called to be holy and set apart so as to reveal to the world the true heart and nature of God. And one of the things that was happening within the culture around them was abusive male-on-male relationships through either temple prostitution to other gods, or these types of apprenticeship relationships where if you wanted to learn a trade or move on up in a particular field of career, you had to enter a apprenticeship that was actually a form of sexual slavery and debasement. So that is one of the ways that I think we can all agree that abusive homosexuality that forces people to into these behaviors is bad. That's wrong, and no one should ever have their ability to earn a living or their ability to worship God be conditional upon their sexual practices. I think we can all agree on that. I personally, in discussing verses about homosexuality, still struggle with a background that has taught me that all of this is all bad and that God never intended it. But yet I balance that as an Episcopalian with scripture, tradition, and reason, where I see good people who love and serve God in beautiful ways who also happen to be homosexual. So I take this verse within the context of the historical environment, and I look at the fact that it's specifically addressing one type of behavior, and I try and keep it in that context. But everybody has, in the beauty of the Episcopal Church, scripture, tradition, and reason to lean on in the ways that we interpret things. But we do make a commitment as baptized Episcopalians in our vows to honor the dignity of every human being. And so I hope as we continue to work our way forward in a culture that disagrees on what is okay and what isn't, and in a religion where people disagree, that we can disagree in love and recognize that our service to Jesus comes first. That's what I will say about that. And we will move on to the next verse. A man must not defile himself by having sex with an animal, and a woman must not offer herself to a male animal to have intercourse with it. This is a perverse act. I hope that we can agree that bestiality is perverse and not a part of God's good gift of human sexuality. Do not defile yourself in any of these ways, for the people I am driving out before you have defiled themselves in all of these ways. Because the entire land has become defiled, I am punishing the people who live there. I will cause the land to vomit them out. You must obey all my decrees and regulations. You must not commit any of these detestable sins. This applies both to native-born Israelites and to the foreigners living among you. God expects the people to hold themselves to a standard of behavior in order to maintain their blessing and relationship with God. So, we talk about holiness and personal conduct entering into chapter 19. This idea that as a community called out and set apart, there are community standards of how to live, but there are also personal standards of holiness. And the idea that all of us have an obligation to live into a relationship with this God. The Lord also said to Moses, "Give the following instructions to the entire community of Israel. You must be holy, because I, the Lord your God, am holy. Each of you must show great respect for your mother and father, and you must always observe my Sabbath days of rest. I am the Lord your God. Do not put your trust in idols or make metal images of gods for yourself. I am the Lord your God. When you sacrifice a peace offering to the Lord, offer it properly, so you will be accepted by God. The sacrifice must be eaten on the same day you offer it or on the next day. Whatever is left over until the third day must be completely burned up. If any of the sacrifice is eaten on the third day, it will be contaminated, and I will not accept it. Anyone who eats on the third day will be punished for defiling what is holy to the Lord and will be cut off from the community." So again, God is reiterating, what does it mean to be in relationship? It means to be set apart. It means to live differently than those around you. And it means loving God and putting God first. When you harvest the crops of your land, do not harvest the grain along the edges of your fields, and do not pick up what the harvesters drop. It is the same with the grape crop. Do not strip every last bunch of grapes from the vines, and do not pick up the grapes that fall to the ground. Leave them for the poor and the foreigners living among you. I am the Lord your God. So when we talk about Leviticus and we talk about all the things that it says to do, I think verse 9 and 10 are some of the most important verses of Leviticus, this chapter 19, verses 9 through 10. And personally, I think that these, if we're going to keep quoting things from Leviticus and say people of God need to do this or not do this, these are the two that I would be using, because these are the two that say, listen, yes, when Jesus eventually says the poor you will always have among you, yes, but God designed a way within the Israelite society for the poor to always be taken care of. And that was by not harvesting and living to the very maximum of what our land can produce. It's by leaving aside a portion for the poor to glean from, to have enough, and not just of one type of thing, but to have enough of all of the goods of the land. That was important to God. And so when we talk about sexual purity, we also need to be talking about purity in the ways that we use our income. Because if we live to the very end and edges of our means and set nothing aside for charity, we're not honoring God. And God then goes on to say, do not steal. Do not deceive or cheat one another. Do not bring shame on the name of your God by using it to swear falsely. I am the Lord. Do not defraud or rob your neighbor. Do not make your hired workers wait until the next day to receive their pay. Remember, everything in this time was daily wage, daily bread. And so if you didn't get paid that day, you didn't have the ability to eat or necessarily have a roof over your head that night. It was vital to take care of people and not abuse them when they worked for you. Do not insult the deaf or cause the blind to stumble. You must fear your God. I am the Lord. So, unfortunately, in addition to Christians' tradition of denigrating homosexuality, there's also a strong stand of tradition that has blamed people for their own illness, that has said that your blindness is a result of your sin or your parents' sin, or your deafness is a result of this. We'll see this later when Jesus and the Pharisees say, well, who sinned, this man or his parents, when the man is blind? And when Jesus goes to heal this person, he says, neither. But that's not a radical departure. That's not Jesus being so much more good, loving, and kind and gracious than this mean, wrathful God of the Old Testament, as some people imagine. No. God was always God and had the same character. That is to say, don't insult deaf people and don't hurt blind people because they can't see who did it to you. Also, do not twist justice in legal matters by favoring the poor or being partial to the rich and powerful. Always judge people fairly. We in life have an obligation to try and be fair, even though one of the first things I've taught my daughter is life's not fair. Life often isn't fair, but when we issue judgment or when we issue help, we're called to judge people by their merits and also by their circumstances within, not just, oh, they're poor, they need this, or oh, they're rich, they couldn't be lying. No, judge individually. Do not spread slanderous gossip among your people. Again, as a priest, this is one of those things that, okay, if we're going to start quoting things about Leviticus, this is another one we should be quoting. We need to be careful how we talk about one another. I think especially in an election year, we have plenty of examples of people saying, well, all of those people who voted this way are this, or all of those people who listened to this person are evil. We need to be careful of these generalizing, slanderous statements that don't listen to the individual and don't seek to be truthful. Again, don't gossip. If someone asks for something as a prayer request confidentially, I keep it confidential. And if someone asks for a prayer request and they don't tell me, please share this, I don't share it. Because unfortunately, I think our Christian communities can sometimes gossip in the guise of prayer. And, oh, pray for this person who's having this. So I err on the side of caution, and unless someone asks me to share their concerns, I keep everything private and confidential. I want to be careful to not be part of the way that we gossip. Also, do not stand idly by while your neighbor's life is threatened. I am the Lord. There's no such thing in Christianity or in the Israelite community as an innocent bystander. The idea that we are called to advocate for our neighbor when they are threatened is something that carries on today as Christians when we seek to love our neighbors as ourselves. Do not nurse hatred in your heart for any of your relatives. Whew, that can be a hard one for some people, depending on your family dynamic, depending upon the people who are in your family. Now, this is not saying you have to love everybody warm and fuzzy and be just so happy to hang out with them at Christmas and Thanksgiving. That's not what God is saying here. But God is saying, don't nurse hatred. How many of us have known of a family arguing over something that they can't even remember what it was because they've been nursing a grudge for so long? Grudges don't survive if they're not regularly fed. And so don't continue to feed hatred. It is okay to set boundaries. It's okay to cut people off who are abusive or harmful. But that doesn't mean you have to continue to remind yourself of all of the bad things that they said or could be thinking or doing. That's something entirely different. Don't nurse hatred. It's not healthy. It's not healthy for you, and it's not healthy for God's kingdom. Confront people directly, so you will not be held guilty for their sin. Remember, Matthew 18 later on is going to tell us how to go to people directly when we are hurt or when someone has sinned against us. We are supposed to be telling people when their sin impacts us. And how they respond to that confrontation or that discussion is not our responsibility. God absolves us from responsibility if we will but take care to tell people. We're not responsible for how they respond, but we are responsible for at least giving the opportunity for them to repent. Do not seek revenge or bear a grudge against a fellow Israelite, but love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. You must obey all my decrees. Do not mate two different kinds of animals. Do not plant your field with two different kinds of seed. Do not wear clothing woven from two different kinds of thread. So again, Israelites are being set apart from the community. God is giving these messages of, here's all of the ways that you are to be set apart by being kept pure. And it's being kept pure throughout your garments, throughout your fields, and throughout your human relationships. These don't generally apply to us as Christians, again, because I'm wearing polyester cotton blend right now. But we use different symbols of the ways that we're set apart. If a man has sex with a slave girl whose freedom has never been purchased, but who is committed to become another man's wife, he must pay the full compensation to her master. But since she is not a free woman, neither the man nor the woman will be put to death. Now this sounds kind of weird, but again, God is offering grace by saying she wasn't free, this wasn't her choice, and she will not be put to death for adultery. The man, however, has a consequence. The man, however, must bring a ram as a guilt offering and present it to the Lord at the entrance of the tabernacle. The priest will then purify him before the Lord with the ram of the guilt offering, and the man's sin will be forgiven. Sins have consequences that are costly, and God sets the cost so that people will consider the cost when they do their actions. Verse 23, when you enter the land and plant fruit trees, leave the fruit unharvested for the first 3 years and consider it forbidden. Do not eat it. In the 4th year, the entire crop must be consecrated to the Lord as a celebration of praise. And finally, in the 5th year, you may eat the fruit. If you follow this pattern, your harvest will increase. I am the Lord your God. So again, this is kind of a weird thing in the ways that we might honor God or not. But God is patterning a lifestyle that says you have to be planning for the future always. You have to be thinking 3-4 years ahead. You're not just living your life for today. You're living for the harvest of the future. That's part of what we're trying to do here in the Church of the Nativity as we set our goals for the amount of money that we're doing in our campaign pledge, is to say we're not just trying to survive today, but trying to plan for a future. And God is challenging the people to live and think in these ways. Do not eat the meat that has been drained of its blood. Do not practice fortune telling or witchcraft. Again, trying to be God or control God or do things that will control the outcomes of the future. All of these are an abomination to God because we're supposed to rely on God for grace and for our sustenance. And if we're trying to figure out the future, that means we don't trust that God has our utmost good and our glory for the whole world in mind. Or we're just really selfish and don't care about the utmost good and glory of the world. We're just caring about, do we benefit from it? Either way, those aren't good patterns of behavior. Do not trim off the hair on your temples or trim your beards. Do not cut your bodies for the dead, and do not mark your skin with tattoos, for I am the Lord. Again, these are all practices that were done by various cultures and communities around at the time to set them as followers of this or followers of that. So God says, don't do these things, so you won't be marked as one of those people, but will be set apart as one of mine. Again, we don't really care if you trim your hair before you come to church anymore, or trim your beard. And I myself have a tattoo. None of these things keep you cut apart from God forever. They were specific cultural practices of the time. Do not defile your daughter by making her a prostitute, or the land will be filled with prostitution and wickedness. I would hope that that is not something we need to be told. Yet sadly, human trafficking continues throughout history, and unfortunately, the people who are most likely to abuse children or to place children in danger are their closest relatives and the people who are supposed to keep them safe. And so we need to be reminded of this. Keep my Sabbath day of rest and show reverence toward my sanctuary, for I am the Lord. Do not defile yourself by turning to mediums or those to consult the spirits of the dead. I am the Lord your God. Stand up in the presence of the elderly and show respect for the aged, for I fear your God. I am the Lord. Do not take advantage of foreigners who live among you in the land. Treat them like native-born Israelites and love them as yourself. Remember that you were once foreigners living in the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. God is reminding them of the purpose of all of this. The purpose of all of this is so that they will be set apart and blessed, so that others will see and want to be part of that blessing. It's not to say, hey, we have this special relationship you can't be a part of. Idea from the start was this special relationship would be continually inviting foreigners and others in to enjoy the same relationship with God. Do not use dishonored standards when measuring length, weight, or volume. Your scales and weights must be accurate. Your containers for measuring dry materials or liquids must be accurate. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. You must be careful to practice all my decrees and regulations by putting them into practice. I am the Lord. So God set all of this up to help the Israelites stand out and be set apart so that others will want to be in relationship with their God too. And that's what we hope we're still doing today even though we don't do it in all of the same ways with the same laws and decrees. So that's where we'll stop for today, and we will pick up next week with Leviticus chapter 20.